Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on your time zone. My name is Chris Martin, and I am the Associate Director of the Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies at Harvard University. On behalf of my colleagues and co-organizers, I'd like to welcome you to our final panel in the Queer Focus series. With generous sponsorship from the Association for Slavic, East European, and Eurasian Studies, as well as from peer regional centers throughout the US, this series is now in its fourth year, having previously centered on themes such as race, intersectionality, and decolonization. This year's series, which is focused on queer communities throughout Eastern Europe and Eurasia, was developed and executed by myself and my colleagues Emma Pratt and Alicia Baca at Ohio State Center for Slavic, East European, and Eurasian Studies, and Zsuzsanna Magdo at the University of Pittsburgh Center for Russian, East European, and Eurasian Studies. Excuse me. I'd also like to take the chance one final time to thank our institutional sponsors, including our peer regional studies centers at the University of Kansas, the University of Michigan, the University of Texas at Austin, UNC Chapel Hill, Indiana University Bloomington, the George Washington University, the University of California, Berkeley, and Arizona State University. And last but not least, we extend our gratitude to all of the speakers in the series for answering our call and stepping into this conversation, which is so critical to our field. Today's focus in Queer Focus is on Ukraine. Before I hand it over to our moderator, a bit of housekeeping. Please use Zoom's Q&A function to pose questions for our speakers. Any questions that come in through YouTube will also be channeled to our moderator. So it is my pleasure now to introduce today's moderator, Alex Averbuch. Alex is a scholar, poet, and translator. He is currently a postdoctoral fellow here at the Davis Center, where his research focuses on the creativity of World War II-era Ukrainian forced laborers and prisoners of war, in particular their literary, visual, and photographic attestations. In general, his research explores gender and critical race theory, commodity culture, epistolary, photography, theatricality and performance, translation, and creative writing. Alex has published extensively on Ukrainian, Russian, and Jewish literature from the 18th century to the contemporary moment, in particular on topics related to femininity, queerness, homoeroticism, gender otherization, material culture, performativity, and constructs of power, as well as intercultural and transepochal phenomena in Eastern Slavic and Jewish literatures. He is co-editor of a forthcoming volume on articles of epistolarity, censorship, and totalitarianism in the Ukrainian context. In 2021, he established and has since run a first-of-its-kind research group on queer studies in the Slavic context, which currently lists over 100 international scholars and features monthly online seminars. Additionally, in collaboration with the Kuhl Center for Ukrainian Canadian Folklore, Alex organized and continues to curate a digital archive for the Writings from the War Project, which collects and disseminates testimonials of Ukrainians about their experience of the Russian invasion. He's the author of 3 books of poetry and an array of over 60 selections of literary translations between Hebrew, Ukrainian, Russian, and English. His latest book was a finalist for the Shevchenko National Prize, Ukraine's highest award for works of culture. He has organized numerous academic and Ukrainian cultural events, including the Festival of Contemporary Ukrainian Poetry, for which he edited a special issue of Ukrainian Literature, a journal of translations, which is dedicated to the participants' work. So he's clearly an excellent choice to moderate and lead our conversation today. And thank you, Alex, for doing so. And I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Chris, for this kind introduction. Thank you to our participants and attendees for joining this unique session. Before I begin, I would like also to acknowledge another deadly attack by Russia on Ukraine that took place today morning, resulting in widespread destruction and loss of civilian lives. And may their memory be a blessing, and may those responsible for these daily crimes be brought to justice and face severe consequences. I would like to express my deepest gratitude to my home institution, the Davis Center, and its collaborators and co-sponsors for this unique opportunity to focus on Ukraine's queerness. And today's panel features 4 outstanding scholars of Ukrainian studies, each of whom will share their perspective on that topic. Now, given its imperial and Soviet past, Ukraine might seem patriarchal, ethnocentric, and heteronormative. But today's panel will challenge these assumptions. It will reveal Ukraine's inherent queerness, its geographical, cultural, sexual, and linguistic multiplicities. It will also exemplify how queerness has gone beyond gender and sexuality to address language, race, class, and post-coloniality, to critique concepts in these categories and examine how they are constructed and deconstructed. The panel will explore how queer artistic spirit and civic agency thrive in the liminal spaces of social existence, evincing adaptability, evasion, and fluctuation. These qualities condition Ukraine's queer hybridity, which is reactive to various forms of suppression, and they motivate its current struggle for liberation from colonialist attempts to rehomogenize. Ukraine's colonial past and the colonial present are fueling this queer in-betweenness, which in literature and culture at large and society faces off against historical and still extant normalizing biases. Consequently, in the Ukrainian canon, we see literary escapes from literary and creative escapes from these biases involving all manner of textual and behavioral adaptiveness, masking, and various fluidities, ethnic, linguistic, geographical, cultural, in historical perspective and today. Importantly, Ukraine's queerness can be defined from the standpoint of what we might call national impossibility when the underrepresented nature of the country in the colonial context, of course, itself becomes a queer feature. It is crucial, moreover, to connect this inherent queerness to the current war and Ukrainian national revival, in which queer escape does its part to decolonize the mono, hetero, and binary and uphold these multiplicities and borderland experiences evinced by Ukraine's texts, topoi, and peoples. The war, to be sure, destabilizes the conceptualizations imposed on Ukraine and its canon and lands a new polarization to difference and deviation. However, at the same time, we do see uncertain implications of this destabilization. Wartime conditions is queer expression and its inclusion in the canon, but at the same time, wartime anxieties foster a suspicion of it as a potential menace to Ukrainian nationhood. So I will stop here and will introduce our speakers. Professor Tamara Hunderova is a Doctor of Science and corresponding member of the National Academy of Sciences of Ukraine. She is the Principal Research Fellow at the Taras Shevchenko Institute of Literature in Ukraine, Associate of Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute, and the Dean of the Ukrainian Free University in Germany. Currently, she is a visiting professor at Harvard and visiting scholar at Princeton. She is also a member of PEN Ukraine. Professor Hunderova is the author of multiple books. I will list just a selection, a short selection, including Lesia Ukrainka books of Sibyl, the Post-Chernobyl Library, the Ukrainian Postmodernism of the 90s, Transit Culture, Symptoms of Postcolonial Trauma, Kitchen Literature, Travesties, Franco, and Not Kamenyar, Femina Melancholica, Sex and Culture in the Gender Utopia of Olga Kobylyanska, and more than 300 articles and chapters on modernism, postmodernism, feminism, postcolonial studies, and history of Ukrainian literature. Professor Hunderova taught at Princeton and Harvard, at the University of Toronto, at Greifswald University in Germany, Ukrainian Free University in Germany, National University of Kyiv-Mohyla Academy in Ukraine, and at the Taras Shevchenko National University of Kyiv. She is a former Fulbright scholar, visiting scholar of Monash University, and the recipient of multiple fellowships, such as the Petro Yatsik Distinguished Fellowship, Shklar Fellowship, Foreign Visitors Fellowship, in Hokkaido University, Munk School of Global Affairs Fellowship at the University of Toronto, and the Fellowship of Philip Schwartz Initiative of Alexander von Humboldt Stiftung at the University of Gießen. Our second speaker is Vitaly Chernetsky, who is a professor of Slavic languages and literatures at the University of Kansas. A native of Ukraine, he received his PhD in comparative literature and literary theory from the University of Pennsylvania. He's the author of Mapping Post-Communist Cultures, Russia and Ukraine in the Context of Globalization, and of 5 edited or co-edited volumes and numerous articles and reviews. A book in Ukrainian titled Intersections and Breakthroughs, Ukrainian Literature and Cinema Between the Global and the Local is forthcoming. His published translations into English include 2 novels, 2 poetry collections, and numerous shorter literary works, as well as scholarly articles and historical documents. Translation of Sofia Andruchovich's novel Felix Austria is forthcoming. He's the editor of the Ukrainian Studies book series at the Academic Studies Press. Professor Chernetsky is a past president of the American Association for Ukrainian Studies, and in 2024, in the current year, he is serving as the president of the Association for Slavic and Eastern European and Eurasian Studies. Our next speaker is Dr. Sandra Joy Russell, who is a visiting lecturer in gender studies at Mount Holyoke College here at Massachusetts, trained in comparative literature and women, gender, and sexuality studies. Her research examines how the feminist and queer literary and visual cultures of Ukraine enact a politics of care and belonging and engender a powerful anti-colonial ethic, and she positions Ukrainian queer and feminist genealogies within broader transnational and anti-colonial discourses. Her latest chapter, titled Are These Guys Gay or Merely from Moscow? Homonationalism and Martyrology in Ukrainian Literature, 1991 to the present, was published in the edited collection entitled Queer Transnationalities. In addition to her research and teaching, Dr. Russell is also the associate editor of Pathony magazine and the editor of Ukrainica, the primary database of Ukrainian studies, an online catalog of English translations of Ukrainian literature and film, supported by the Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute. Our fourth speaker is Daphne Rachog, who is a PhD candidate in anthropology at Indiana University in Bloomington. Her research interests intersects at the junction of global health, gender and sexuality studies, and Ukrainian studies. Her most recent chapter, titled Nudes by Army Boots, Agency, Subjectivity, and the Erotic Ukraine War, explores the Terror Only Pants movement and how the all-out war in Ukraine was shaped public discussions on gender, subjectivity, and nudity. Other works can be found in Anthropologica and Economic Anthropology journals. She has an MA in Anthropology from the University of Alberta in Canada and a BA in Cultural Studies from Key Mohila Academy in Ukraine. So each presenter will have roughly 12 minutes, followed by Q&A. And now I would like to invite Tamara Hundorova to start our session.
Thank you so much for the invitation to take part in this very interesting seminar. And thank you so much for your kind introduction. And I would like to talk today of how queer theory converges with anti-colonial criticism in Ukrainian literature, and whether Ukrainian subaltern resistance can be identified with queer. In general, of course, I just remind you that in a broad sense, queer is about resistance, maybe the main idea. It is resisting the dominant culture's ideas of normal, celebrating the margins, revealing the difference, blessing ourselves. It is a movement, of course, committed to the disruption of power relation. And we all know that this idea also a basic, a very important idea that also is substantial for decolonial, post-colonial criticism. In fact, many scholars emphasize that a very substantial, a very important issue to my mind. This is the intersection of queer theory, queer studies, and postcolonial studies as well. And my idea is that it is maybe very important, especially when we're talking about Ukrainian literature, Ukrainian case, to consider how queer sexuality and queer identity, how it plays and what role it plays in Ukrainian literature, and especially how it became also a means of represented anti-colonial implication and resistance. Of course, this is a very big question, so I would like also to touch on a few aspects of this very important and I think very perspective for the study for Ukrainian studies aspect. I'd like to emphasize, first of all, that I see that in Ukrainian literature, queer often function as a symptom that manifests resistance and does so in a way that subvert the self-evident notion of power and patriarchy, and also subvert or reveal the complexity, the ambivalence of relationship between center and periphery, metropolis and colony. Actually, queerness as a symptom manifests a Ukrainian resistance to oppression of the empire, which turned it into a colonized province of the Little Russia, as we know, in connection to the Russian Empire. Its orientation, feminization, and exotization as a province, as well as its endowment with threatening Gothic monstrosity, becomes quite remarkable. For instance, I can also remind about Gogol's and his exotization of Ukrainian Mal-Russian province is particularly noteworthy in this regard. Starting from the Romantic period, which with its peculiar attention to transgression and ambivalence, queer aesthetics acquire a special significance in Ukrainian literature. Queer identification becomes a means of undermining the colonial structure of power imposed by the empire on the subjugated territory, in particular in form of patriarchal heteronormativity. It is the empire, along with its domination, that spreads heteronormativity and patriarchy in the colonized territory as a means of power and control. As Franz Fanon notes, colonialism and racism as well virtually demasculized and disempowered the subaltern black man. At the same time, the straightening of patriarchal heteronormative forms that in colony drives the colonized to imitate this relationship, often in a reversed and very violent way. I quote Fanon, who says that many demasculinized black men attempt to gain a sense of empowerment through the wide hegemonic masculinity in imitation, often taking too aggressively patriarchal extremes. As a form of resistance, gender identification and queer identification in this situation, from the point of view of colonizer, obtain an additional anti-colonial meaning as well. But it is also very important to, and we have many examples of how this patriarchal look affect the tradition or traditional way of life of a subjugated territory, a subjugated and oppressed people. And this is very important, and maybe the one of the notable figure in Ukrainian literature in this sense is Shevchenko. Shevchenko demonstrates how colonialism introduced form of patriarchal heteronormative relation in the Ukrainian community, and how its effect and actually brings to catastrophe. The key poem in particular is Katerina, a famous Taras Shevchenko's poem, which depicts a situation where a girl sexually abused and abandoned by a Muscovite soldier, Moskal, Shevchenko called it, who arrived in the village for posting. She forced to leave her old parents, her village, and go out in the world as a stranger. So this is how the traditional family, the village order, the ideal folk community, as Grigory Hrabovich calls this, is being destroyed, and it became a kind of a very significant catastrophe and ruin of traditional way of life. Shevchenko generally associates colonialism with numerous cases of incest, rapes, sexual violence, and the fate of the abused girls, which he symbolically identifies in his romantic view with the fate of Ukraine as a raped movement and mother. As a poet, Shevchenko is sensitive to national catastrophe and national trauma, demystifying the relationship between the center and the province, and symbolically opposing the heterosexual patriarchal violence that were brought to Ukrainian society by agents of empire, be it a soldier or landowner or the other. He symbolically undermines it and provides social, national, and gender resistance by taking the side of the alternative and resisting in such a way. He identifies himself with a non-normative oppositional identity, queer identity. This is about Shevchenko's so-called femininity, not just the female character in his poem. Scholars have observed the presence of a so-called feminine elements in his imaginary and self-identification. Stepan Balev, one of the authors who apply psychoanalytical approach to analyze Shevchenko's poem, calls Shevchenko's variant of masculinity, I quote, the endyminoonic motive, and emphasizes the feminine traits in the poet's psyche, the daydreaming and passivity of his lyrical subject, and the numerous instances of self-identification with his female character. Actually, queer sexuality, which is reflected in Shevchenko's self-identification and imaginary, requires additional meaning, not as a feature of his gender identity, but also the form of anti-colonial resistance. The anti-colonial aspect of queer identity can also be observed in other Ukrainian authors. A notable figure is Arkhangel Krimsky, who was born in an impoverished family of priests in Ukraine, left home at the early age, and actually ended up in the Lazarevsky Institute of Oriental Languages and became a lecturer at Moscow University. Krimsky spent much of his life in Moscow, coming to Ukraine only occasionally, but he consciously identified himself as a Ukrainian. He depicts his ambivalence of being between an empire man or imperial subject and a subaltern Ukrainian in many of his quite autobiographical characters, and call it, it also reminds us of psychopathia sexualis, he calls it psychopathy nationalis. Finally, the writer also marks the anti-colonial researchment of his largely autobiographical character, Andrei Lahovsky, as a queer identity in one of his famous novels, Andrei Lahovsky. The latter's queer sexuality is largely combined with his anti-imperial reserve. As a colonial subject, he is in the service of the empire, as a teacher in the family of a Russian general, and as a professor at the capital's university. But as a Ukrainian, he makes a career in the center of empire, Moscow. However, his sense of subalternity fits his homoerotic desire, recording his resistance to the heteronormativity of the imperial individual, whom he also is, and Krimsky also demonstrates in this novel. In conclusion, I would like to emphasize the actualization of queer identity as a marker of anti-colonial resistance now during the Russian Ukrainian war, which of course has a very evident neo-imperialist characteristics. I'm referring to the ontology which was published in last year, Anthology Queer Ukraine, an anthology of LGBT plus Ukrainian voices during wartime. In the previous authors, this anthology was published by Edvika and Rebel Queers. This is a group of queer activities and artists from Kiev and London as well. And they state that, I quote, the Ukrainian decolonization struggle is fundamentally queer. End of quotation. This also emphasizes the colonial nature of homophobia under Russian colonial rule. The authors generally call, and it is very important for me and needs to speak more about this. This is blending of anti-colonial resistance and queerness, as they call it, a Ukrainian queerness. So both historically and in modern time, I quote them, queerness in Ukraine has meant resistance to direct queerophobia and condemnation from the metropole, resistance to its gruesome after effects on the post-colony, resistance against the erasure of your whole being. Thank you for the attention.
Thank you very much, Professor Hunderova. And now I invite Vitaly Chernetsky.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Alex, for inviting me to be part of this panel. And thank you again to the Davis Center and all the other peers for organizing and sponsoring this very important panel series. And like Alex, I would like to also to begin by acknowledging the horrors of another criminal attack on civilian targets that Russia perpetrated overnight. I do have slides to share. I will start them right now. And we'll go to the beginning. So I'm grateful to Tamara Hunderova for starting us a little bit with a theoretical reflection. I will also would like to add a small amount of theoretical discussion by bringing the idea of queer utopian, queer futurity. And this is where Ukrainian experience speaks again particularly strongly as something that enriches queer theory, because I think it is important as we look in the history of how queer theory developed, we need to acknowledge, of course, the fundamental traumatic impact of the AIDS crisis and the many deaths that it brought about in the 80s and first half of the 90s, and how that impacted both political activism and intellectual work. And for some queer theorists like Leo Bersani and Lee Edelman, this led to the development of what came known to be as an antisocial thesis, which is a criticism of state structures and any sort of communitarian ethics. But very soon, in response to that, alternative visions have developed that were affirmative and positive. And here I would like to just very briefly highlight three theorists and their ideas. Eve Kosovsky-Sedgwick, one of the founding parents of queer studies, Jose Esteban Munoz, and Michael Snedeker. For Sedgwick, what is important is her idea of reparative reading, which is something that she distinguishes from what is known as paranoid reading. Sedgwick, in her paradigm, proposes what she calls a less aggressive, less thesis-driven, less angst-ridden style of critique that would seek to repair the damage of homophobia and other forms of prejudice and violence, rather than simply revealing the allegedly new and ever more insidious forms of abuse. This is how Ellis Hansen paraphrases Sedgwick's approach. And Munoz, in his wonderful book, Cruising Utopia, builds on Ernst Bloch's idea of the principle of hope and He warns against simplistic utopian thinking, but he is looking at what he calls acts of queer world making through performance of queer utopian memory, a utopia that understands its time as reaching beyond some nostalgic past that perhaps never was, or some future whose arrival is continuously belated, a utopia in the present, creating perhaps fragile spaces, but affirming them. As he puts it, this summons a refunction notion of utopia in service of subaltern politics. And the example of reading Franco Harris' poem, Having a Coke with You, is an example which creates utopian potentiality in the everyday, in the quotidian act. And that, I think, could be an inspiring example. And Snedeker, in his book Queer Optimism, talks about counterpublics and queer culture as a form of counterpublic. And he describes, what he calls a meta-optimism and queer grace, that queer optimism is something that has learned from death, learns its vocabularies to the point of saturation, and in an act of bravery so unfamiliar as to seem impossible, departs from them. He also closes his book's reflection with the final imperative of Derrida's closing text that is actually read at Derrida's memorial after he passed away, affirm the survival, affirmer sans cesse la survie, which I think is very important for us. Tamara has already talked a lot about how we theoretically conceptualize queerness in combination with a post and decolonial vision within Ukrainian culture, and especially with even central canonical figures like Taras Shevchenko, Ukraine's national poet. If we look at the history of how Ukrainian the queer thinking has progressed in modern times, we have to acknowledge our deep debt to Solomia Pavlichko, who as a pioneering feminist scholar of Ukrainian literature, and also the pioneering scholar of queer themes in Ukrainian modernism. She touched on Olga Kobylyanska and Lesya Ukrainka and the homoerotic tones in their correspondence, on homoeroticism and Kobylyanska's fiction. She talked about queer themes in later Ukrainian modernism, including Viktor Petrov, known as his pen name Veda Montovich, and Agata Krymsky, whom Tamara also mentioned. Her book on Krymsky, Solomia Pavlichko's book on Krymsky, remained unfinished at the time of her untimely tragic death from an accident, but it was published later and is available. And of course, we need to acknowledge that the moderator of our panel, Alex Averbuch, is a wonderful Krymsky scholar himself and has contributed a great deal as well. So yes, we have queer undercurrents in many canonical Ukrainian figures. The great 18th century philosopher and poet Grigory Skovoroda, again, both his Platonic style dialogues and his correspondence are huge sources for that. In Ivan Kotlяревsky, the founding father of modern vernacular language Ukrainian literature in late 18th, 19th century. In Shevchenko, as Tamara has just mentioned, and of course in Mykola Gogol, aka Nikolai Gogol, whom Tamara mentioned as well. As we know, queer studies in Slavic begins with Simon Karolinsky's book, The Sexual Labyrinth of Nikolai Gogol, which had an explosive impact on our discipline back in the mid-1970s. So Ukrainian culture was there since the very beginning, also the development of queer studies within Slavic. Olga Kobylyanska and Lesya Ukrainka, whom I've just mentioned, the importance especially of Kobylyanska's story Vals Melancholique, which is a utopian union of three women, at the center of the story, and their correspondence, which is intensely passionate, uses secret language, and deserves to be viewed on par with other great examples of queer history in Europe and worldwide at that time. Agata Krymsky, whom Tamara has also mentioned the concepts of love and shame in his work, and the tragic love in his life at multiple times, and his honesty in writing about that. Again, I would refer folks to Alex's own wonderful work about it as a historian and as an analyst. We also, of course, have queer presence in Ukrainian visual art of the fin de siècle. Vsevolod Maximovich, whom dubbed the Ukrainian Aubrey Beardsley, is an essential figure in this respect. Vedamantovich or Viktor Petrov, his novel Dr. Seraphicus is probably the most important one, and we are all waiting with anticipation the publication of a new edition of this novel, which should be out in May, and which includes previously unpublished chapters from the early drafts, and I'm really curious to find out if there's more queer material there. We also have a very interesting development in the historical later periods, when under Soviet repression it was not possible to express queer culture, but we have diasporic Ukrainian culture making a very important contribution. Emma Dievska, a wonderful poet who just celebrated her 93rd birthday the other day, made two very important contributions to queer discourse in two of her poetry volumes. Especially important for me is what she did in her 1962 book Ryba и Rozmir, Fish and Dimension, where in addition to poetry published under her original, under her name, she presented two cycles of what she billed as translations of poets she invented. And she invented two different poets. She invented a Cavafy-like Greek poet whom she made Aristodemos Lichnos, and a Harlem Renaissance poet. And she wrote wonderful cycles of poems in Ukrainian from those masks. And in Aristodemos Lichnos, we have a pioneering, bold articulation of queer desire of the kind that openly stated that we had not had in Ukrainian poetry prior to that. She continued this practice in her 2002 collection Khvili, where she created a new mask of a classical Persian poet, and also presenting homoerotic work of this kind. As we move to Ukraine that regained its independence after a collapse of the Soviet Union, there are several important contributors that I would like to highlight and that I wish that folks would explore in depth. One of them is Anatoly Belov, a visual artist and performance artist and musician, a leader of the queer punk rock band Людська подоба, which means human likeness. And you see here Belov himself, and on the left, standing in front of the video that he created, which is a pioneering work of Ukrainian queer cinema that was part of his exhibition at the Pinchuk Art Center at this point 11 or 12 years ago. I also would like to note the important impact of Ivan Kozlenko in his novel Tanger, which was published in the first edition of serial in a periodical in 2007, in a revised edition in 2017. The novel, which is set in Odessa, constructs a utopian space through multi-directional memory, and it is structured similarly to Michael Cunningham's The Hours, but in the way that Cunningham engages in dialogue with Virginia Woolf's Mrs. Dalloway, Kozlenko's dialogue is with Yuri Yanovsky's Meister Korabля, and it creates a pansexual, open, queer, positive utopian space, both in the 1920s it discusses, and in hope for the possibility of creation of that utopia in the present of the novel, which is the late 1990s, early 2000s. I also would like to mention the important presence of trans voices in contemporary Ukrainian culture, and I would like to highlight Friedrich Chernyshov, also known under his pen name Fritz von Klein, a trans poet and activist, originally from Donetsk, a bilingual poet writing both in Russian and Ukrainian, numerically to date more poems in Russian. And Friedrich is now a refugee in Austria, and I just put here a poem of his that is written in Russian, but it addresses the trauma of both the queer aspect of the trauma and the national aspect of the trauma that Ukraine is experiencing in the context of Russia's escalated full-scale invasion since February 22, and the fundamental shocking transformations of identities that Ukrainians are dealing with. In the interest of time, I will skip reading. Hopefully folks can see the text on their own. And another wonderful utopian example of queer positivity is the film Stop Zemlya, directed by Katarina Hornostai. It's a utopian coming-of-age film set in a Ukrainian high school that presents a queer affirmative space. And very importantly, for many Ukrainians, it was the last film they were able to see in theaters before Russia's full-scale invasion. You see a photograph of a billboard of advertising the film on a street in Kyiv in late February of 22. There has been a lot of activism happening. There's been a lot of work in promoting this understanding of that activism, where one of our co-panelists, Daphna Rachok, has done very important work. So I will let her speak about it in greater detail. And I would like to thank you for this opportunity. No homophobia, no Russian imperialism. Let's join in queer resistance for Ukraine. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you so much, Vitaly, for this comprehensive and condensed multidisciplinary trans-epochal survey into the Ukrainian queerness. Sandra, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Can you hear me? I had to switch to headphones. Okay, great.
Yes.
There's some noise outside. I hope it's not distracting. All right, I'm going to also share my screen. Okay. And everyone can see? Okay. Thank you so much, Alex, first of all, for inviting me to be part of this panel. I feel so honored to be among some of my favorite feminist and queer Ukrainian scholars. And Tamara and Vitaly have already talked in really rich ways about some of the histories of queer representation, bringing some really wonderful theorization into this discussion. I want to talk a little bit about the present as yet another literary scholar. I want to talk a bit about, some of the more recent representations of queerness in Ukrainian literature and art, and I'll just talk about a couple of examples. But what I see is kind of a historicization of representation of historicization of queer identities in art and literature. And I'm kind of just putting some questions on the table and asking us to think about what this tells us about queer futurity. I know Vitaly already mentioned this, but I'm thinking about also kind of this reclamation of maybe a history that has not been that has been occluded in a lot of ways. Not that it hasn't been there, but has been through forces of repression and erasure, right, have been kind of occluded or overlooked. So I think I see this historicization as part of a project of building a new archive and kind of marking Ukraine's relationship with queer histories and queer identities. And I also want to consider the kind of politicized aspect of this conversation too, and how gendered and sexual bodies are always in conversation and participation of nation building processes, right? Because we know that the way that societies are built, their gendered and sexualized and racialized bodies are implemented in those practices. And if we're bringing colonialism into the conversation, which we absolutely should, right? Colonialism produces norms and expectations for bodies and identities. And so queer life and queer practices are part of a part of a resistance, so a long history of resistance to those forces of colonization. So I'm curious about what this tells us, if we're thinking historically, about what we can imagine or how we might imagine new worlds, right? Not just in Ukraine, but beyond. So a couple of examples, and I won't belabor this because Tamara already mentioned this wonderful collection, this recent collection of Queer Ukraine. I have it right here. Pick it up. It's great. They also have a Instagram that you can follow. I wish they updated it more, but it's not just about the anthology. I mean, it's about they talk about work that they do, but they also bring in other pieces of conversation, kind of thinking about what queerness is, both in a Ukrainian context and beyond. So follow them if you happen to be on Instagram. And I just wanted to pull out a couple of examples of this. So Maxim Erstavi, who I think Vitaly mentioned, if not, he has written a lot about Ukrainian queerness and Ukrainian colonial histories. He has this essay that kind of serves as an introduction called Ukrainian Queerness, where he thinks about what it means to hold queer identities in Ukraine and what kind of histories that holds. So I'll just read a couple of passages. This is like other Russian colonies, formal attempt to criminalize, marginalize, or erase Ukrainian queerness, all traced back to times of Russian rule. Traditionally matriarchal Ukrainian society was historically more comfortable with expressions of femininity and sexual and gender diversity. And I know this has already been touched upon, but just kind of also this practice of kind of helping readers and an English reading audience, particularly, to understand and recognize the complexity of this history, right? And as I think as an opposition or in resistance to Russian colonialism and Russia's kind of very openly homophobic presence in history. So the other essay is Yana Lys, who writes about transness in traditional Ukrainian culture. And she gives a long history of trans identities and going back to antiquity, thinking about different kinds of gender diversity in Ukrainian history. And she writes, when modern authoritarian conservative socio-political forces call for restrictions on the rights of the LGBTQI+ community, saying it does not correspond to traditional Ukrainian culture, they're either lying or simply ignorant about our country's history. So I think this does, I have the next, I'll come back to it. I think this does a number of things. I think this brings builds community with using queerness to build community and solidarity. But I also want to kind of ask us to think about what it means when we look for queer figures in the past, like what that does, like what that tells us, how that shapes our understanding, our knowledges of identity categories themselves, right? Because we know that they are bound to the times and places in which they exist. They're not timeless categories. So, I could just ask us to think more about what that means, what limitations are there potentially. I also want to talk about Anton Shvetsko's work. He's an artist. I encourage you to also check out his website. And I'm just want to focus in on his very brief and subjective queer history of Ukraine. And there are multiple parts to this, but one part is a timeline where he does a similar thing, where he gives a longer history of queerness in Ukraine, starting in the 900s in the Kievan Rus with Volodymyr the Great. And this is just an excerpt, but you can download it. You can download the entire PDF, and he updates it, I believe, at least yearly, if not more. And here is an installation shot from Warsaw. I think this is all the way through 2022. So he's also kind of asking us to think about this much longer history, archive, representations of queerness, and what that holds in terms of how we're thinking about the present. And I know I touched on these points. I need to move this thing. It's distracting. 1 second. Yes, as I mentioned, this does multiple things. It brings visibility to queer identities in Ukraine. It builds community and solidarity and shared experiences. I think that this also responds to Western assumptions about absences and repressions, assumptions about homophobia in Ukraine, which homophobia is everywhere, right? I think this is also something artists get at, is that the kind of hypocrisy and the assumption of a global binary, whereas like the liberal progressive West has achieved this kind of liberation, queer liberation, and the so-called East has not, right? Or Eastern Europe being part of that conversation, or maybe, yeah. So I think this is also in resistance to those assumptions, right? To reveal the complicatedness of gender expression, sexuality in the context of Ukraine, and also to add, I think, the kind of the geopolitical aspect of this that in recent years, right, particularly since 2014, the representation, and even like the administrative changes that have happened in Ukraine with regards to LGBTQ identities have been a way to align Ukraine with European values, whatever that means, right, real or imagined, and give it a kind of moral legibility to demonstrate, yeah, that there is this kind of progress around civil rights and human rights. And I have one more slide. So just to kind of conclude, I want to also ask us to kind of think about how we're defining queerness, right? I think often it is a shorthand for identities and bodies and lived experiences that resist norms, right? That resist, again, the norms that are produced through colonialist knowledges. But also, I want us to think about it as a project and a practice of imagining a different kind of world. And I see queer Ukrainians doing this already. I think this is part of how I'm defining it, is this kind of dreaming of what kind of world we want to live in, and how our bodies and our lives can live and exist in resistance, in opposition to the norms that have caused oppression and violence and subjugation. I also want to emphasize the importance of recognizing patterns of colonialist knowledge and violences and violent systems, right? I think that in the Ukrainian case, right, there are some unique things, but we can talk about how colonialism has patterns, right? Other systems of power and domination have patterns too. White supremacy, misogyny, right? Patriarchy, they have patterns. So to recognize, how colonialism is part of this conversation, that they are reproduced through division, right? They're dividing, because queerness, of course, is not a monolith, right? And I think sometimes there is division within movements, within solidarities. So the stratification of our struggles reproduces these problems. So I hope that we can find solidarities in liberation struggles within and beyond Ukraine, and I would include Syria and Palestine in that, and to kind of think about what it is how we are marking queerness as part of that struggle and part of a way of thinking about new worlds and forms of resistance to those struggles. So I'm going to end there. Thank you so much, and I will start sharing my screen. Okay.
Thank you very much, Sandra. Daphne?
Thank you so much, Alex. Thanks so much, everyone. So I am the only non-literary scholar in the room. I'm an anthropologist, so bear with me, because the way anthropologists talk, we do it a little bit differently than literary scholars. But it kind of like also feels great to be the last person to speak, because I can draw on the insights, I can draw on the presentations of Tamara, Sandra, and Vitaly. So I think that to start thinking about the particularity and special features of Ukrainian queerness, the question that Alex has posed to us today, it means also to think through Ukraine positionality, history, and very lively and vibrant current discussions about decolonizations, and current discussions about Ukraine's place in world's history and on the world's map. And I'm really grateful that Tamara kind of like prompted us all today by her reminder that we always have to look at these intersections between decoloniality and queer theory. And in my response to what distinguishes Ukrainian queerness today, I would probably like to start thinking about this like very recent history. And since Ukraine independence, really, public discussions about queerness, about LGBTQI issues, they have been highly charged and geopoliticized, and kind of like I'm also picking up here where Sandra left off, that a lot of references to queerness and Ukrainian independence, they kind of like went hand in hand to this idea of Europe, European values, again, like for whatever they meant, right? Because quite often Europe, it was kind of like left as an empty signifier. So for quite some time, talking about queerness inevitably meant referencing some sort of bigger picture, a sudden political future, if you wish. So in this way, Ukrainian queerness has been in many ways linked to futurity. And I think that in this sense, queerness in the public discourse has also been linked to this anticipatory aspect, to things that might have occur in the future. So it was filled with potentialities, kind of like spilling into the realm of utopia, if we borrow from Jose Esteban Munoz. And I'm also very thankful to Vitaly for bringing a more theoretical background to think about queerness and utopia. However, I think that lingering in this potentiality may not be really possible when your very existence, physical existence, when your livelihood is threatened, as it has been, especially during the last 2 years of the full-scale invasion. So in this sense, I think the full-scale invasion of Ukraine by Russia that happened more than 2 years ago, it contributed to reshaping Ukrainian idea of queerness. And here I am slowly approaching my main argument, is that I think that one of the distinguishing features of Ukrainian queerness, as of now at least, is the fact that it does not contradict or oppose the idea of state in any way. And thus, in terms of identities, one's identity as a queer person does not really stand in any contrast or opposition to one's civic identity as a Ukrainian, as a person who is belonging to the Ukrainian nation state. And here I'm building off of some research that I did together with my colleague and co-author, Ivan Shmatko, because we have been interviewing LGBTQI people who volunteered to join the Ukrainian army after the full-scale invasion. And during these interviews, we noticed very unexpectedly to us that how people talked about their LGBTQI identity, how they talked about their queer identity and their civic identity, meaning as a person belonging to the Ukrainian nation state. So how people talked about these two identities was very uncommon and kind of also contrary to what a lot of scholars writing in the tradition of sexual citizenship and working in this tradition of sexuality and nation state, what they had written about queerness and state earlier. So, I mean, it is really not a secret that queer studies have had a long tradition of suspicion of treating the idea of nation state with a suspicion, right? Thinking that the nation state is often, if not inherently, homophobic, and scholars working in the tradition of sexual citizenship also frequently indicated how much of the discourse about rights and obligations, how much of that is really underpinned also by this like implicit presumption of heterosexuality. So kind of like both of these traditions, the one interrogating the nation state from the queer perspective, and also the one that was exploring the limits and possibilities of sexual citizenship. Both of these traditions kind of like have often used the language of conflict and exclusion to operate, to think about queerness and the idea of the nation state. And quite often also the language that they have used to talk about queerness and the nation state was also the language of a zero-sum game. So that kind of they wanted to indicate that belonging to nation state kind of like always is at odds with the more equalizing queer project. So when our interlocutors, queer Ukrainians who volunteered to join the army after the full-scale invasion, when they started talking about their motivations in joining the army, we were incredibly surprised as researchers, because really we stumbled upon their answers to the question about the influence, if any, of their queer identity on their decision to join the armed forces of Ukraine. And I just like want also like to preface the rest of my presentation by saying that when we were asking them the question, it was supposed to be a question that does not generate any particular insight. Just like the question that you ask people, and you ask it even though you exactly know the type of response that you're going to receive, or at least this is like what we thought, that people will reference this kind of like Russia's homophobia, the kind of progress, quote unquote, that LGBT movement has achieved in Ukraine since its independence. And there was none of that. Because in reality, a lot of our interlocutors, they struggled really to understand the question. They struggled to understand what we were asking of them, which was very puzzling to us because most of our interlocutors, they were also incredibly active in LGBTQ movement. They were very active in the queer community before joining the army. And this kind of like misunderstanding, this silence that kind of like this silence that lingered after we would ask these questions, it indicated to us that, okay, like there was definitely some kind of like a pattern there. So after thinking about it for some time and after analyzing the interview transcripts, we kind of like found out that this kind of befuddlement that we as researchers encountered was due to the fact that we as researchers, we were primarily academically socialized into this Western queer theory and also mostly Anglo-American studies on sexuality. So we had certain expectations of how people would talk about their queer identity and about their identity as a Ukrainian freedom fighter. We were expecting these identities to be kind of like at odds and somehow interacting, if not intersecting. However, the case that we were dealing with, as we kind of like understood post factum, it was really the case of parallel identities, as we have termed it. And identities can be strong yet dormant when it comes to certain issues, right? And this is not a secret. This does not seem to be that counterintuitive. Someone can have an identity of a father, of a soccer player, or a musician, and yet all those identities may be irrelevant when it comes to voting, for instance, or the decision to join the army. However, the trick is that we often assume that a political identity, that queer is inherently a political identity, and we often assume that it would have strong influence, strong bearing on certain decisions like joining the army. And this is, of course, like a separate, a huge separate topic of like why do we expect that to happen? But for whatever that reasons may be, like as of now, I can certainly say that at least in this case that we have encountered, our participants, they refused to surrender to these assumptions. The story that they consistently told us was that they strongly identified with the queer community. They would readily spend time and other resources to fight for the interests of queer community in Ukraine. And yet, this queer identity had nothing to do with their decision to risk their lives and well-being by going to war and joining the army. So in a nutshell, their queer identity would appear only when it was relevant in their minds to the issue at hand. And the defense of the state, the defense of the Ukrainian state and the nation was also in their minds clearly marked as something that was not the responsibility of this queer identity. It was marked as something that was the responsibility of their identity as a Ukrainian. And this kind of like clearly does not fit the narrative that the idea of the nation state and queer project are at some kind of tension, if not irreconcilable, because at least in the minds of our interlocutors, everything was kind of like very clear and orderly, put in place with a tag of it. So at this moment, I think it is this feature that kind of like distinguishes Ukrainian queerness. It shows how queerness and the project of the nation state may coexist, and that corresponding identities, they may exist kind of like in parallel without really interacting or being at odds with one another. And in many ways, I think this serendipitous discovery leads to my final point, which is the need to theorize from the periphery, including the need to theorize queerness and the need to theorize the state from the periphery. Because before the full-scale invasion, peripheries like Ukraine, they generated very little scholarly interest, and Ukraine was rarely studied on its own terms without kind of like pre-imposed frameworks and theories. And most scholars, at least in social sciences, who were interested in the questions of sexuality, they would really focus on Russia and Russia's weaponization of homophobia for political purposes. And when scholars in social sciences turned their attention to Ukraine, they would often turn to Ukraine in order to inquire about either homophobia or about how ideas, again, of westernization and Europeanization kind of like impact LGBTQ rights and the discourse on queerness. However, as I have hopefully showed, when we allow peripheries to speak on their own terms, we can really produce sometimes unexpected and serendipitous discoveries that kind of like have the potential to speak contra the hegemonic narrative. Thank you.
Thank you, Daphna, for the talk. And thank you all for the very diverse presentations. Each touched upon very different philosophical, existential, and even practical aspects. And I'm also very happy that we managed to provide a larger picture of the Ukrainian queer history through multiple disciplines and also epochs. I will initiate our discussion, and I will pose a very general question to which Daphna already started answering. You all mentioned aspects of repression and colonialism which invoke, spur, motivate queer expression. And Daphna has just mentioned that Ukrainian queerness doesn't stand in opposition to the Ukrainian nationhood, to the Ukrainian national identity. And as we know, queerness often in scholarship, and not only in scholarship, is framed as an oppositional category to various solidities, and ethno-nationality is one of them. And this argument is actually supported by previous speakers who mentioned queer persons, queer authors, such as Taras Shevchenko or Agat Angel Krimsky, who lived extensively for extensive periods of time outside of Ukraine, however, maintaining strong national ties, national sentiments in their writings, in their identity, so on. So, and this rather paradoxical phenomenon probably distinguishes Ukraine in its queerness, although, as Laura Lessig tells us in the chapter Patriots and Perverts, this is not always the case. So, and Ukraine is not the only country, Ukrainian people, not the only people who have been experiencing historical suppression and escape, mimicry, and performativity related to it. So my question is maybe to also to other panelists as well, but Daphna, if you have more insights, please join. What, in your opinion, distinguishes Ukrainian queerness, and can it be differentiated, distilled from other regions or nations' manifestations of queerness? Please, any of you?
Okay, I'll start talking about the historical perspectives. That yes, starting from now, of course, the fact that we have Ukrainian nation as an imagined community, especially in the context of war, built on values, and the value of inclusivity and diversity is one of its essential parts. So this explains in part the deep, profound, and really far path that Ukrainian society has gone in terms of embracing and accepting queer presence and queer community within it, including within the armed forces. But of course, a lot still needs to be done. A lot, and the Ukrainian queer activists in the armies, like Viktor Pilipenko and many others, they continue advocating that very serious change needs to be happening. And the fact that it is Ukrainian queers in uniform that right now are in the forefront of social change. If we look historically, the fact that embracing, openly advocating Ukrainian identity was a dangerous position, and we had a combination, the way Ukrainianness and queerness could be closeted. you could pass in the imperial society, and this is in some ways can be analogized to the situation of Ireland within British Empire before Irish independence. And other examples where we have a really complex dynamic of interaction between embrace of national identity as an oppositional, as a challenge thing. So Krymsky in this sense is a great example, and how it then intricately is connected with questions of sexuality.
Thank you, Vitaly.
Can I add share my thought as well? It is very important. You put very important question, and what is a special feature of Ukrainian queer? And but it seems to me it is maybe we cannot formulate in such a way what is what the distinct features, what define specificity of a special character of Ukrainian queerness. It seems to me this is a kind of trap for our understanding of queer theory and Ukrainian as well. So, of course, what is very important for me is just to take in mind the experience, not only Ukrainian situation, but also around the world, and also to use this parallel in comparison with the other situation, with the other country, especially post-colonial as well, because they have a very similar experience like we in Ukraine. What is special, it seems to me, in Ukrainian situation, is it a contradiction that is traditionally developed during the last time between nationalism and queer identity, queer sexuality, queer practices. And even today we have, of course, we have a different understanding of nationalism. Is it essentialist or constructive or liberal as well? This is the main problem. And this idea and discovering of the parallel existence of queer and national identity in contemporary Ukraine, for instance, is very, very important, because it shows actually that a queer community, they identify the member of this community, they identify themselves like a Ukrainian, which is very important, because during the last time, in the Soviet time maybe, they look to find their society, their milieu. They go very often to Russian culture as well, or the Western culture as well, but they don't identify themselves with Ukrainian tradition, with Ukrainian literature culture as well. And now we have a very, very, very important changing that in the representation and identification as a citizen of Ukraine and belonging to Ukrainian state as well. But we have the other problem still is not resolved as well. This is from the point of view of understanding of nationalism, like Dontsov nationalism or the other as well. So and this problem, it seems to me, is very important, and we have to speak more about this and to try to analyze it, to show and to explain that anti-colonial theory, anti-colonial movement, anti-colonial resistance has many common with queer resistance as well. So, and it seems to me it's a field that became open for us, and it is very important for the future. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Tamara. Other reflections?
Yeah, I will just add, I won't add a lot more, but because Tamara and Vitaly have already spoken to this quite thoughtfully, but I would just, and I think I mentioned this in my talk, that, queerness is always respective to the spaces in which it exists, right? It always forms out of particular political and historical and social, cultural conditions, right? So it's always unique in some sense, but, I think with Ukraine, and as Tamara just said, there is this complexity to the question of nationalism and national identity and queerness being part of that building of a national identity. I would also include feminist thought as part of this too. And these are also movements and knowledges that were for many years not seen as objects of investigation or inquiry, right? They weren't legitimized in the same way, particularly during the Soviet Union. So you had a lot of like clandestine movements. So I think that's part of maybe that is a feature of Ukrainian queerness, where, and as I mentioned, we're trying to produce archives now that maybe were occluded or are just invisibilized in previous years.
Thank you.
Yeah. Sorry, I would just like add briefly, if you don't mind, about thinking about the future of Ukrainian queerness. In addition, like to thinking about like how queerness coexists with the civic identity. And here I want to think about queerness as a kind of like this broadening of the norm in terms of how we think about bodies and sexualities. And here I want to stress more these like bodily aspect, and also like kind of like point us in the direction of thinking with disability, because unfortunately wars inevitably result in injuries to people's bodies, and whether you're in the army and whether you're a civilian who was kind of like hurt in a missile strike and like we know that Ukraine has been incessantly bombed by Russia, and just like this morning, right, there were again like horrific strikes that Russia committed. So I think that the future of Ukrainian queerness, I think it will be also very much connected and focusing on this issue of disability and kind of like broadening the norm of what is a normal body, how a normal body should look like, and kind of also like stressing the presence of somewhat like injured, disarticulated bodies in the public space, and also kind of like focusing on these bodies that were sometimes like erased from the visibility. So I think we also like have to think about this kind of like intersection between queerness and disability.
Thank you very much. Thank you to all the queer nationalists. I would add also probably the Ukrainian language and the languages of Ukraine, in particular Surgic, which is a very hybrid language, a very resistive one to grammar, to nationalities, and so on. And also probably Ukraine's geographical liminality, hybridity, in-betweenness between the West and the East, and also probably historically speaking, also various homosocial environments, such as, for example, Zaporozhye Sich, the very homosocial Kazakh culture. But let's move to a couple of questions that we got. The first question is to Sandra, and it deals with the current current queer movement in Ukraine, within Ukraine. You mentioned examples dated a couple of years, 2 to 5 years ago, that they are very well known in Europe, especially because those authors are not living in Ukraine. So have you been in touch with queerness in Ukraine in more recent years? And have you heard about gender Z and their work? And please be brief because we have another question.
Yeah, this is a great comment, and I really appreciate it. And I focused on these two examples just because they are dealing kind of with historicizing Ukraine. But I appreciate the noting that these folks are in Western or living abroad, right? And they're speaking to Western audiences. So also there is a conversation to be had about how might that reproduce other kinds of colonialist knowledges if we're not talking directly about queer identities, queer folks in Ukraine. I don't know about Gender Z. This sounds like something I should read more about and think more about. I will mention, and I didn't bring this in just for the sake of time, but Masha Samashina they've done amazing work on, I went to a panel last year where they were talking about the younger generation in Ukraine writing fan fiction in an archive of our own about Zelensky particularly, but about other figures in the Ukrainian political sphere and writing queer erotic fan fiction. Sometimes it's erotic, sometimes it's on the border of erotic, but kind of thinking about queerness as part of the kind of care and belonging that are produced in these spaces where there is immense violence and fear. And again, I can't take credit for that research, Masha Samashina. They have done wonderful work on it, but that is an example that I think is really important for this conversation of like how queer people in Ukraine are writing to one another in these spaces that are virtual, and including, and it's anonymous, I believe. I think it's exclusively anonymous. So how that produces different kinds of recognitions and visibility of queerness as a form of care and belonging in a moment that is quite violent and difficult. So, but thank you for that question to whoever asked it.
Thank you, Sandra. And we have a question from Danilo Lashishin from the Northwestern University. To all the participants, what role do allusions to historical queer Ukrainian figures play in the LGBTQ+ rights movement in Ukraine, as opposed to references to European values or the military service of queer Ukrainians? Do these historical references help in gathering political allies for concrete policy goals, such as the legalization of same-sex marriage?
This is an interesting question. I would say that this is more important for the queer community itself, but yes, it is also important in the public discourse to counteract the homophobic talking point that queer culture, queer identities are a foreign import. So tracing roots, reconstructing the fragmented, suppressed tradition that needs to be archaeologically unearthed and carefully pieced together, it is similar to the experience of other discriminated historically and oppressed minorities. Here I think of what Sandra Gilbert and Susan Goubart talk about, the anxiety of authorship for women authors in male-dominated literary tradition. Just the bravery of being an author and speaking and creating something. It's not that you have the competition of all the previous greats that you are fighting against, but on the contrary, you're trying to trace the history of others who tried before you. So I think this is a very important gesture, both internally for the queer community in Ukraine, for building its historical understanding, especially given how fragile queer archives are. And yes, in the public discourse too, we can think of, historically 30 years ago, the reaction to Solomia Pavlichko's article on Olga Kubelyanska and Lesya Ukrainka was explosive. It really shook Ukrainian society profoundly. But it started a very serious discourse, in addition to some regrettable and not serious answers. But that's always, visibility comes with pluses and minuses. And there was a milestone in terms of visibility, in this case, historical visibility.
Thank you, Vitaly. Just unmute yourself, Tamara, I see.
It seems to me it is very important, first of all, to emphasize maybe or to give to explain the broader meaning of queerness as well. And I liked very much this, that we can, of course, it's very important to emphasize and to look at him in a frame of inclusive thinking as well. And yeah, I liked very much this mention of disabled people as well. And it is also tolerance to multilingual as well aspect of Ukrainian society. So it's very important to explain actually and to introduce queer practices as well in the cultural practices and political and others in a kind of canon, of cultural canon, literary canon as well, like a part, like a very important part of our tradition, of our experience. And so this is maybe like an instrument of bringing, of supporting, of enlarging this idea of diversity. And it seems to me, I liked very much our discussion. It seems to me we have such a, we already started to think in this broader understanding, a large understanding and deep understanding of queerness and queer practices. So it seems to me it is very important. And the other as well, it is also important that we also maybe to pay attention not only to use some ideas from the West about queerness and LGBT identity as well, but it also to introduce and to show our experience to the world. For instance, when I was writing about Lesya Ukrainka, actually Vitaly said, of course, that this is Solomia Pavlichko who introduced this idea. But my idea, when I started to enlarge and to show this very special communication and relationship and utopian ideal communication between Lesya Ukrainka and Kobylanska, just because I was shocked how it is similar to the other experiences such a type in the different country and different literature. So we have also to introduce and to become a part of the general practices, not only national practices, but also around the world. This is also very important. Thank you. To become a part of this cultural dialogue and exchange.
Thank you, Tamara. Sandra or Daphna, any comments? No?
I would just really briefly add, and I already kind of said this, but I just thinking about what, again, back to this, how we're defining queerness and how we're thinking about queerness, particularly in a time of war and genocide. And again, moving beyond bodies and identities, but thinking about forms of care and belonging, and how I think queer resistance has always been invested in, again, imagining futures, imagining forms of belonging, and imagining forms of belonging that can sustain a nation beyond, right, beyond the kind of norms that have not done that work. So how do we produce communities that can help us survive under systems of domination, including colonialism, among others? So that's my dream for queerness.
Thank you, Sandra. So if no more questions or reflections, this has been a very enriching and thought-provoking panel, as well the entire series, and this is very much needed in our field. I would like to also use this opportunity to invite you to our queer seminar, which I run. If you have papers, ideas, articles, chapters, books recently released to present and discuss, to get some exposure, please reach out to me and I will schedule your work. We meet monthly, every last Sunday. So thank you very much, and I'll pass on the mic to Chris for the concluding remarks.
Yes, thank you. Let me echo Alex's thank you, especially to our speakers today, Daphna, Vitaly, Tamara, Sandra, and of course, Alex, and members of our audience at both today's sessions and all of our previous sessions. As a reminder, you can view any and all of this year's panels on the Davis Center's YouTube channel. I just put the link in the Zoom chat, but it'll also be available through the Davis Center website. So thank you all so much, and we look forward to seeing many of you at next year's series in Focus. And until then, take care. Thank you.